Sol Reserve, I'm going to ask about that later, is an emerging Western Australian poet of Indian descent. Her poetry explores the tumultuousness, yes, it is that. I knew I was going to stumble on it. I've actually underlined it here, of love and the fantasy and zest in nature. Her writing anatomises the complex linkages between history, language, culture and perception. Her debut collection, Lake Song, was recently published by the Centre for Stories, which explores themes of love, nature and culturation. Yeah? So with that, I think I better hand over to you before I trip over this damn thing again.
Thank you so much, Ron. And thank you, Cindy, for sharing your story. You'll see the reason why I'm here sharing my story today. Perhaps it's not what you expect, but it's a story that I have lived. And so it comes from that place. And I'm thankful to Centre for Stories, Louisa, for helping me, because I didn't think I had a story in me. And she was the one who brought it out. So thank you very much. And thank you for being present here and listening to the story. I want to start by asking you to stand in my shoes. And I know it's a difficult thing to do. So I'll give you a few hints as to how. I arrived here in 2016. I left my country, my home, everything that was familiar, my family, my friends, everything I had grown up with. And I arrived here in Australia. It was a strange country. Even the landscape was different, something that you don't expect for it to be different, but it was. And I was looking for finding a sense of belonging, a sense of connection, a sense of community. So I was actively looking and wishing. And I think sometimes there is an energy, I don't know, whatever you call it, but that energy looks out for these wishes and thoughts, and it gives it to us. So I came upon this advertisement in the newspaper. It was the Wetlands Centre in Coburn, and they were looking for volunteers to join their team. And the Wetlands Centre, I'll explain, is a small community-based organization, and they're a not-for-profit. And they're looking after the wetlands around Coburn, which are very similar to the wetlands out here, something akin to this space, but we are into conservation work. So I thought to myself, the environment is definitely something I'm passionate about, and I should respond to this. So we took a walk, and I used to live in Cardinia, which is just like 3 kilometers away from the centre. And I took a walk, went down to the centre. The walk is very beautiful. It goes along North Lake, and then Bibra Lake, and then down to the centre, where everyone was out at the gazebo enjoying morning tea. So it was as if I had just entered this space where everyone was smiling, happy, and they looked at me and welcomed me. So quite literally, from that day when I went to the centre, I didn't leave the centre. I've been going back week after week, month after month, since 2016. I've been involved with all kinds of things, weeding and planting, and also the barbecue sizzles. So it's been really great. Now, I want you to imagine me finding this community, this beautiful, magical space where I felt that the space actually embraced me. It took me in. And this was also the time of turbulence. The Row 8 protests were happening. To give you a bit of an idea about what the Row 8 protests were about, they wanted to build a highway through the wetlands. they wanted to build a highway in between North Lake and Bibra Lake. And they were really without any concern for the wildlife and the interconnectedness between these bodies of water as well as the bushland. The wildlife don't know how to navigate a road. And we've got turtles, frogs, swans, birds, lizards, all this wildlife trying to cross the road and navigate the road. And you'll have all these complexities to deal with if the highway was to be put through. So for me, the impact of this was huge. I realized that this actually meant that my world was again being threatened. The place that I'd found my connection to, the place where I had started building my roots, the place that I had started getting to know was under threat. And it could vanish the next day, or it could just be erased. And that was really, really a huge concern. And so I became a participant in the protest. Now, I didn't take a full-on role where I was the frontline protester. I was still behind the scenes, going to the wetland center, bringing up food, putting together platters of food, cutting up fruit. We used to get massive donations. So we used to get fruit and food and all kinds of things donated to the center. And it was my job, along with a team of volunteers, to cut up the food and to distribute it to people who were out there and who were facing this conflict and in the sun and in the heat, having these tough sort of situations to face. And I used to make tea and coffee and get drinks, but also have some hard conversations with people who were undergoing all this, who were out there in the tent huddled together. And it was a gloomy situation because a patch of land had been raised. So I want to paint a picture as well of these two beautiful trees. They're called the honeymoon trees. And these trees sort of are at the entry point of Bibra Lake. And for every image of Bibra Lake that I have in my mind, these two majestic pine trees sort of are the defining feature. And these two trees were just raised to stumps. So for everyone who's seen these trees, because they've been around for the last 100 years, it was an incredibly emotional loss to see that they're just stumps and they're left there as stumps, as reminders, as painful reminders of something that happened in that space. And then I also have an image of this young woman who stripped down, completely naked, and climbed atop a tree to save it, because she realized if she stripped down and she was naked, the cops couldn't handle her because it would be considered assault. And so she climbed atop a tree and stayed there for hours together, and she managed to save that tree. So these were the heroes that I was getting to know. There were people in the community who had been there for 20, 30, 40 years, fighting this fight, looking after pieces of land, patches of bushland, tree. And they were out there in full force. And some of them talked about the Farrington Day protests. So if any of us is familiar, I think that was sort of the defining moment for a lot of protests, especially Row 8. So they wanted to, again, put a road through the wetlands. And there was only a bunch of activists, academics, and such who really knew the restorative power of the wetlands and the healing power of these spaces, so who were really actively protesting back in the day. This is 30 years ago. And it was a losing battle because they, of course, lost the battle. And there is Farrington Road that has been built. To this day, we get phone calls from people who spot a turtle crossing the road, especially during nesting season, which happens between September to January. You've got mama turtles who have eggs in their body, and they try to cross the roads. And we get phone calls, frantic phone calls. We've spotted a turtle. And we are only a couple of kilometers away. But by the time you reach there and you locate the turtle, 9 out of 10 times, the turtle is squashed. And again, this is another really painful reminder of the world we are living in, where our wildlife is being threatened unnecessarily, and it is becoming sort of everyday occurrence. Nobody gives a second thought to this. But the few activists who had gathered protesting for for Warrington Road actually realized that one of the reasons they lost was because the community wasn't behind them, and the community wasn't aware of these things happening. They didn't know what the wetlands were. So they wanted to put together a little center so they actually established the Wetland Center in Coburn with this idea to educate, inform, create awareness, have educational programs, land care programs, look after the community and keep them involved in the sort of things that are happening to our wetlands. Now, once you realize that this was the reason the Wetland Center was established, then you know very clearly, 30 years later, when Row 8 protests were happening, why the Wetland Center was an epicenter for all this activity and all this protest. But now, people had been informed. For the last 30 years, there was advocacy, there was education, there was awareness created. And there were lots of people. There were educators, of course, but there were scientists. So everyone was really, really involved and aware of what they were fighting against and fighting for. And they gathered together. And so this beautiful protest, which brought together so many people, also gave me a space where I learned about the center and the community in a very, very sort of a challenging way, because it could change tomorrow. I also want to touch on Noongar leadership and the Aboriginal leadership and why it was important throughout. So Auntie Marie Taylor is a Noongar elder, and she's the elder in residence at the Wetland Center. And she's a force to reckon with. But more importantly, she's a person who takes people under her wing, and she brings people together. And she was so instrumental during the protests, giving us those insights that we really needed to push through with the protests. But also afterwards, in the rebuilding, rehabilitation work that we undertook at the center, and also like in the community. One example of how this insight and leadership is important is 10 years ago, we wanted to build a boardwalk on Bibra Lake. And if you've seen a boardwalk anywhere else, it's simple enough. You put pillars, you put the boardwalk, and there you go. But this was different because we opened up to community consultation, and we also got our Aboriginal elders and community involved in the decision making. And some of them came to us and they said, well, Bibra Lake is sacred. It's a sacred water body. And it has a huge significance to the Aboriginal heritage. And so we must not drill on the lake bed. So this was an important suggestion, because what it did was brought about a little bit of engineering and innovation. And now you had a solution, because we have a beautiful boardwalk in Bibra Lake, but it's a floating boardwalk. And it was constructed with this idea that we must not drill on the lake bed. So it has taken that idea, put a boardwalk there, and also the boardwalk is in the shape of a snake-necked turtle, which is iconic because the southwestern snake-necked turtle is endemic to the southwestern part of Western Australia. So very, very iconic critter that comes from this region. So we've created this boardwalk, and this is what happens when people like Auntie Marie, people from the community, people who've been advocates and activists, people who worked in this area for the last 20, 30, 40 years, come together and fight for a cause. So I'll explain the outcome of the Row 8 protests, probably to kind of conclude and lead to what I was suggesting. That since all these people came together with this incredible knowledge of the history and the impacts and the environmental concern, we won against that fight. And the Belia Regional Park has been given environmental protection. It's a Class A reserve. And the question of a road will never arise again. And we will never have a road running through that space ever, ever again. Before I give you the mic, I also have a little snippet that I want to share that will sort of bring this story and emphasize what I really want to say. There was a patch of land, a patch of nature back home, back in India, my favorite place. I used to walk on the unpaved roads leading to this lush forest of banyan trees. Banyan trees, if you don't know, are really majestic, huge trees, and there are clusters of them. They grow in clusters, and they all have these roots dangling, so it makes it look really dense and lush. And I used to go there for my walk, for reflection, for quality time. And then we happened to go back last month, and I wanted to visit my favorite park. Only now, the roads are not unpaved anymore. They're paved roads leading up to the park. The few debilitated buildings that we had inside have been rebuilt, developed, and are in use. Because they're in use, there's a parking lot. Because there's a parking lot, there are vehicles. Because there are vehicles and traffic and people, there's rubbish and there's litter. And because they wanted to develop all these spaces, they raised down the banyan trees, which was central to the spirit of that park. So what's left now is a hollow shell of what was really magical and beautiful. What I wanted to really share with this little snippet is, if you don't have people who know the place, who are concerned for the place, who have the knowledge, the historical knowledge of the place, the insights to keep the place and the spirit of the place the same as it was, then you can lose these spaces just as easily, like my favorite park, which is gone. So that's what I wanted to share. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Lakshmi. I will ask you a quick question, but I'm just also, it's an interesting observation and probably one, having to go back to that, back to home for that. Fighting for the things that put roots down as opposed to the things that just sit on the surface. How was that when you were able to do that together with other people in this country for you? What was that like?
I had everything to lose. I had absolutely everything to lose because this was my world that I had started understanding, negotiating, being in. And Bibra Lake, if you have been there, I'm sure there are many spaces just like that, but Bibra Lake speaks to me. And I felt like that space embraced me and called me in, took me in. So I had a huge resonance to that space, and I wanted to do everything to not destroy bits of it. And working with the community is a very interesting experience because it gives you strength. Sometimes when you don't have it, when you don't know what to do, when you especially come from a culture which is much different, just working with the people who know how to do this, who have seen something like Farrington Road being put through the wetlands, and they know what happens when you stay quiet and meek and don't protest. That gives you a huge amount of motivation to just get there, get this done. Yeah, so I felt really great, and I felt very close to the community as well. Thank you.
Again, thank you, Lakshmi.